So my name is Brian Bowes and I work with Media Services, and we are supporting Zoom before, throughout, and after the pandemic, but it's become the majority of our work since the pandemic started. I'm involved on the admin side, and I've learned a lot about Zoom and how it works from the beginning. And I've been involved in the various Zoom bombing incidents that have occurred at Ryerson from the beginning as well. On the admin side, gathering information for Ryerson security or for IT security to investigate. Um, I saw from the registration that several of you have been Zoom bombed, and most of you know someone that has. So it's not as common as we might fear, but it is something that's definitely out there and that keeps happening. And I think that a big part of that is education. If we can learn how to set up our meetings with best practices in such a way to prevent Zoom bombers from joining, or after they join to make it difficult for them to do anything, then we're going to take the fun out of it for them. And unfortunately, it is fun for them. That's what they're after. And we can take that fun away and we can reduce the number of incidents that happen. So the agenda for today, I'm going to just touch on what I'm not talking about for a moment, and then I will talk about what the Zoom bombers do, how they get into the meeting, and then we'll talk about how we can prevent them from joining the classes and the meetings in the first place. And lastly, what we can do to take back control if it should happen, they've gotten in and started doing their bombing activities. And lastly, although it's not on here, I'll just touch on after the fact what you can do to report the incident and best practices for that. And we're up to 29. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for joining. So what I'm not going to talk about is encryption. Zoom has increased its level of encryption. The pandemic, I think it is now on par with Microsoft Teams or GoToMeeting or any of the other major video conferencing platforms available, or at least if I'm listening to Zoom, it is. But I'm not going to talk about that. That's more about data security. I'm also not going to talk about data centers, which is where your data is sent to and then sent from in the process of going from, my webcam to your screen. That's again about data security. And there are actually some options in Zoom we could look at the end if anyone's interested, to make sure that your data doesn't go to a foreign country that you don't want it to be in, because it is possible for other data centers to take a copy of your meeting data before forwarding it on. And if you don't want that, there are options in Zoom for that. But again, not what I'm talking about. And lastly, I'm not going to be talking about code level hacking. And by this, I mean, if you were in a meeting and suddenly smiley emojis were all over the screen and everything started flashing, that kind of code level hacking that can occur is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about bombers, people that want to join classes primarily or meetings at educational institutions such as Ryerson and disrupt or disturb the meeting, offend people, shock people, even scare them. I'm sure there are more words that I could add to this list. This is all I came up with, and a word cloud would have looked better, but I didn't do that. And what they use to do that are the tools that are available to them within the meeting, the chat, if available, using their microphone, their audio, the screen share capabilities, their annotations on screen share, right? Their video window itself and their name. They can subtly type an offensive name. They can also rename themselves if the host has allowed them to do so. And actually, that is a way that bombers will often obfuscate themselves from within a meeting. They'll join, say something offensive in the chat, quickly rename themselves so that when you, as the host, go to look for whoever made that comment, you can't find them in the participants list. So that is a tool often used as well. And lastly, profile pictures. And so if you're allowed to upload a profile picture, you could upload something offensive, turn off your video, and there it is for all to see. And that's a very subtle one, because as you know, in larger calls, people without their video on go to further pages deeper in the call where the host is not often looking. So they will use these tools when they join. And I want to just look at one quick example of Zoom bombing. And this one is not shocking or scary or anything like that. It's just annoying. And the reason I want to look at it is to just quickly analyze how the bomber did what they did, and then we'll discuss it some more. So I'm just going to show you this clip. This is a screen capture from the bomber's screen. So this is what you're looking at. Okay, so what happened here is we were watching what looked to me like some sort of mathematics lesson. Screen share was up and the bomber joined and started playing Never Gonna Give You Up very loudly into the microphone, which is super annoying. So the prof tries to ignore it at first, realizes it's not going to stop, stops the screen share, looks for the participant, mutes them. That bomber then unmutes himself because he's still able to do that. And then the professor boots him out of the meeting. Now, what I'm not going to show you are the subsequent 4 or 5 videos where the bomber continues to rejoin the same meeting over and over again and keep disturbing it. There is a setting in your Zoom account where you can allow people that have been removed from a call to rejoin that call. And this prof or the host of this meeting had that setting disabled. So the bomber was able to join over and over again and keep bombing. I can tell you that by default in all of your accounts, you have that setting enabled. So if someone has been removed from the call, they cannot rejoin that call. So I just want to show you this also right here. This confused face is the prize of the Zoom bomber. And this face they will take a screen grab of and they will put up in discussion groups and congratulate each other. So at the end, when we go into the taking back control section, I want to show you how you might be able to just not give them that satisfaction at all. So how do bombers get into meetings in the first place? They have 2 main ways that I'm going to be discussing, and that is URL manipulation and link sharing. Okay, heavy emphasis on link sharing. So first, I'm just going to do URL manipulation. This is what a meeting that does not have a passcode enabled by default. This is what the URL looks like to join. So up in your browser URL bar, you could enter ryerson.zoom.us/j for join / and the meeting ID. And that is all it takes to be able to join the call if it doesn't have a passcode enabled. It's pretty straightforward. There are scripts out there available on the internet that look something like this. And what this does is it sets a range. This is, I don't know if you're familiar with scripts. I'm not that familiar with scripts, but this is the whole thing. So it's actually pretty short. It sets a range of meeting IDs. So at the top Zoom ID there's the maximum number Zoom ID, and then the P is the minimum number, and then the +1 indicates that each time this script runs, it's going to add 1 to that meeting ID number. It's then going to append that ID to ryerson.zoom.us/j/ and it's going to test that meeting ID. And if it gets a hit, it's going to put that into a file that'll be available when it's done running the script. And if it does not get a hit, if it gets an invalid meeting ID, then it just closes and runs the next time. So within a matter of minutes, this script can test, tens of thousands of meeting IDs on particular incidents, University of Toronto Zoom incident, Ryerson Zoom incident, etc. And can get quite a list of possible meetings to join and bomb. Yes, and so if you've ever received an email that looks anything like this URL manipulation is likely the culprit. So this is one that I sent to myself, but you get this email from Zoom that somebody has joined your meeting. And I often get emails from faculty and staff where they say, I don't have any scheduled meetings, particularly on my personal meeting ID. This one happens the most. I don't have any meetings scheduled for today. Why has this person joined? How were they able to join? Have I been hacked? And you haven't necessarily been hacked, but because your meeting does not have a passcode, anyone could have entered that URL and joined your meeting. If your meeting's not running, it just tells them the time and the date that the meeting is supposed to start, which I suppose they could use to come back and do their bombing thing then. Unlikely. And if you have join before host enabled, then they're actually in the meeting, but because they're the only ones there, they can't do anything. But you will receive this email and let you know that somebody tried at least. And should your meeting happen to have been running during that time, then that would have been a bomber that was in your meeting. So this is a URL with a passcode enabled, and the passcode is not this PWD equals A0D1, et cetera, Nobody typed that in as being the passcode. That is an encrypted passcode. So when you enable a passcode on your meeting, even if it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to look something like this in the URL. This is the meeting ID, and there's the password encrypted. So it's still, you can send people this link, if people you want to join your meeting, they can still click and join that meeting. But this essentially rules out the URL manipulation attempt at joining meetings. So you no longer get those random tests from wherever, whoever, getting in. Now we're going to talk about link sharing. And this is by far the most common way that meetings get bombed. And they will use social media primarily to get this out there. This is from Twitter, leaking whatever, posted. Look at all these hashtags. You can go on Twitter right now and look for any of these hashtags, and you can find meetings to join and bomb right now if you were so inclined, right? This person's included a picture of the meeting ID and the passcode, and that's all you need, because you go to Zoom, you hit join, you type in the ID and the passcode, and you're in. So you don't need the rest of that Ryerson .zoom.us part. You can just enter a meeting ID and passcode and join to bomb. This is a couple screenshots from a Discord server dedicated to Zoom bombing. This is a community of individuals. There's almost 100 of them, and they bomb various meetings. They take this information from Twitter or from their own classes if they happen to be students. And they say, okay, everybody get ready. I'm putting the codes up. Now's your chance. Anybody want to join? And then they do their bombing. They have different levels associated with different activities. So, you know, you were level 1 if you wrote something in the chat, so you're level 5 if you did whatever. I haven't looked that deeply into it to know. I didn't really want to be honest with you. But you can see that they enjoy themselves and they egg each other on. So that exists, it's out there. Here's just a couple more from Twitter. Justin here has been very organized, posted the time, even the Eastern Standard Time for people, ID and passcode, and has suggested some names like iPad or loaner iPad. So Justin knows that this social studies class has a waiting room. And let's be honest, we've all hosted meetings now and we have waiting rooms full of people. Are we really going to not let somebody in if it says iPad or a loaner iPad? Maybe we will, because we want to find out if that person's actually supposed to be here. It's all too easy and all too common for people to be misnamed and come to the waiting room, right? King of Hell over here has done one step further and included a screenshot with the participant list from a previous call. And so they actually have the full names of people that are supposed to be in that class. So you can join this meeting, you come to the waiting room with that name, you're going to get let in. So once the bombers are in, they're looking for those weaknesses that I listed off the top. And the good ones are going to lurk for a few minutes and test things out. Who can they chat with? Can they screen share? They don't need to start screen sharing to find out whether or not they can. Can they unmute themselves? Can they rename themselves? If the screen sharing is already active, can they annotate? Are they able to set a profile picture? Are they able to start their video, their camera? They will test all these things out first, and they may bomb one way then quickly rename themselves and bomb another way, quickly rename themselves and bomb another way. And it's just very irritating and offensive, to say the least, to have your class disrupted this way. So let's talk about how we stop bombers from getting in the first place. I like that stop sign. PowerPoint is not my strong point, but I tried for you guys. We have 3 main Zoom security features to work with. And within some of those features are options that I wanted to point out and demonstrate to everybody here, because they're often not fully understood. So the passcode, we already talked about why that's a good idea. That stops the URL manipulation type of Zoom bombing from happening. But it does not keep Zoom bombers out of your meetings that have the meeting ID and passcode available to them, say from social media or other. The waiting room I'll talk about at the end. What I want to talk about is like the holy grail of meeting security within Zoom, which is authentication. I like that door opening PowerPoint wipe, so I did it again. Authentication. When you require authentication to join and you leave the default Ryerson community, the participants in the call have to sign in to the Zoom client. So the program Zoom itself on their computer or smart device or what have you, they have to sign in somehow. In this case with SSO, because we are at Ryerson. So they need to be validated by Ryerson Central Authentication Server. And that signs them into the Zoom client. And they can then click to join your meeting. The meeting says, who is this trying to join? Is it somebody that is authenticated? Yes, let them in. Somebody not authenticated? No, they get the message saying, this is a meeting for, I forget what it says exactly, to be honest with you, but it tells them they need to sign in first to be able to join. And what this does is it ties all the participant activities, actions, comments, etc. to their Ryerson ID. So there's no hiding anymore. Even if they rename themselves, which if they're allowed to do that, they still show up in the reports that we can generate with an email address, with an ID that we can tie their actions to. So this is definitely the best way to protect your meetings. No one's going to bomb if they're not anonymous, right? They rely on anonymity to hide their actions. This little graphic right here is a pictorial walkthrough of how to sign in to Zoom with SSO. Because when I've asked faculty and staff why they don't use authentication, the 2 most common answers are, 1, it's too difficult for the students, and 2, well, we need some people from outside of Ryerson to join the call as well. So what I want to do, these are people from outside of Ryerson, it's the guests. How do we invite guests? There are 2 ways. And what I want to do is switch to a demo at this point and just walk you through that authentication option. So I'm going to pull up my Zoom here. You all are familiar with this, ryerson.zoom.us. Right here, when you click on this hyperlink, sign into Zoom with SSO, is a link to that graphic that I had on the slide. So this is something to share with students or meeting participants. If they're not sure how to sign in, how to authenticate, it's right there. And the link to it is right on our landing page. So I will sign in and I will go over to my meetings. And I have a few different meetings here. Let's click on one called No Security that I've set up. And I'll go to edit that. Go to the security section, which has been moved to the middle here. So now all these options are together, and I will click to require authentication to join. It says Ryerson community. So the way that authentication works in the background is by validating somebody's domain, the domain associated with the email address on the Zoom account. So if a Zoom account exists registered to an @ryerson.ca email address, that person can be authenticated. What if you need to invite guests? So there are 2 ways here. And the older method that we were telling people about before is to hit edit on this authentication domain specification. And what you see here is this first one, ryerson.zoom.us. So if you are coming from the ryerson.zoom.us site, if you have clicked through to join from there, you're good, because you had to sign in to get into ryerson.zoom.us in the first place. If you are coming with a ryerson.ca email, that's that domain, then you are good. And this one is for captioners that often need to join our meetings. So we've added that in there as well. So if you needed to invite a guest, you would say to your guest, what is the email address you use to sign into Zoom? And they'll say, maybe they'll say something like it's, so-and-so at gmail.com. So if I wanted to add the Gmail domain to the authenticated domains list for this meeting, I would hit a comma and I would add gmail.com. And I'd save. And now that person could join the meeting as well if they sign into Zoom with their Gmail account. But that's not great, because Gmail accounts are everywhere. There are likely billions of them out there, and they don't really tell us any information about the people that are joining. So we just essentially opened our meeting up to Ryerson plus anyone with the Gmail account. So that's not a great way to do it. If, for example, you needed to have somebody from the University of Toronto, or you had a different person from York or U of T joining each week, maybe this would be a better way to go. utoronto.ca, york.ca, and then save, and you wouldn't need to worry about it, probably, right? But a better way to go about this, let me just get this out of here. A better way to go about this that has recently become available as of less than a month ago is this right down here called authentication exception. So this is a way to add one person at a time as an exception to the authentication rules in place. So you leave the rules in place that it has to be a ryerson.ca account, and you can add a one-off person to that. So I can do myself, my personal Gmail account, and save that. And then I'm going to receive in my Gmail account an invitation to join the meeting. So it's just one invitation and it's specific to the person. The caveat being that it has to be an email address that has a Zoom account. So somebody had to go to zoom.us and sign up with their Gmail account. So if that's registered with Zoom, they get their invitation, they can join, anyone from Ryerson can join, and that's it. So those are the two ways to get around the authentication for the cases that you need to. And I showed you where the instructions were for signing in with SSO for those that are unfamiliar with the process. So now you can require authentication to join your meetings, hopefully, and that's going to just eliminate 99% of the possible Zoom bombing incidents right there. Now the waiting room, we know about the waiting room. You've all used waiting rooms before. I just wanted to go to our settings, so within your account settings, go to waiting room and show you that there's a few things to explore here in the waiting room settings. The first, unrelated to security, is that you can customize the way your waiting room looks. So you can add a message here, even a logo. And that may come in useful for security, because if you hit edit options, you can also see these options right here that maybe you haven't looked at before. Who should go in the waiting room? Everyone? Or maybe you don't want to manage a waiting room with everyone. Maybe you have a class with 500 students or more. And what you actually want to do is have people bypass the waiting room unless they don't belong there, right? So you could say users not in your account will bypass the waiting, will be stuck at the waiting room. So anyone who signed into Zoom, who authenticated with their Ryerson address, would bypass the waiting room, could come in and out of the meeting at will. You don't have to manage them in the waiting room. But anyone who forgot to sign in, or anyone that doesn't actually belong there, will get caught in the waiting room. And you can then send them a message in the waiting room. In fact, you could customize your waiting room right here to say, if you are here in this waiting room, you need to sign in with SSO, provide that link with the instructions, and then try to rejoin the meeting. And at that time you will bypass the waiting room. That's my big idea of how to deal with the waiting room situation. And the most important thing I can say at this point in time is that this option is not yet available to you. May 2nd, we are going to make some changes in Zoom security that I don't think affect any of you, but there are many Zoom accounts out there registered with Zoom.us that belong to Ryerson, but they are not currently in our account at Ryerson. On May 2nd, they will be forced to join our account. And so at that point, every Zoom account with an @ryerson.ca address will be in the Ryerson account, and you can use this option. There are other options here to look at. I'm not going to get into them, but you can read them at your own, in your own time. Waiting room, there it is. So now let's just talk about how you can take back control if you're getting bombed. I want to empower people, and I'm sorry I left this towards the end, but it's kind of straightforward. Actually, it is just the security button. There are options to turn on chat, turn off chat, have people rename themselves or not. In the participants window, there are options for what you can do with the chat in the chat window, but everything that involves security and the weaknesses that we already discussed that people like to use to exploit to Zoom bomb are right here in the security button. And what I wanted to do, if you would all indulge me, I'm going to bring over my Zoom window here. And you can see this is my perspective of the Zoom call, and this is my toolbar as a host here. So I have the ability to enable the waiting room at this point, or do things on a one-by-one basis. So let's say somebody wrote something in the chat, I can quickly turn chat off and turn it back on. Somebody's renaming themselves something offensive, I can check that, uncheck that, right? That's one-to-one. But what is super powerful is the suspend participant activities. So something's happening, you're not sure what's happening, you need to deal with it as quickly as possible. Suspend participant activities. You get this right here, and it tells you what's about to happen, but you're all going to notice in a moment. Right now, the chat is off, screen share is off, everything is off except for the host, and the meeting is locked, no one else can join. There's a waiting room, the profile pictures are all hidden, right? And I can find participants to remove. So if somebody wrote something in the chat before they renamed themselves, if I suspended all these activities, then I would be able to go and remove that person. I'd still be able to find them. They couldn't rename themselves. And to avoid that look of confusion on your face, I would suggest that you hit the suspend activities, and then you could just open up your camera and mic like this and continue your lecture. And the Zoom bomber cannot bomb, cannot do anything at this point. They will get bored and they will leave. You can also turn the chat back on, but you can make it for host only at that point. So now students can send you a message. They can still raise their hand and use the reactions emojis. So if somebody needs to ask a question, they can still do it that way. You can give people permission, for example, to you can make them a co-host, which would allow them to screen share without allowing everybody else to screen share. And that is the best way to take back control. Lastly, if you did get bombed, these are the things that we want you to do and not to do. So do not delete the meeting, because likely if you report it, I'm going to be asked to go and look at your meeting settings. And don't be embarrassed, I'm just going to see how it was set up to see maybe how the bomber got in, which actually teaches me the things that I'm telling you today. Do not change the meeting settings, or if you do, because it's a recurring meeting and you want to keep using that meeting, just make note of what you changed and tell us. I'll skip to the fourth one, contact Ryerson Security and include the meeting ID, the time, the participant names, and anything else that you think might be helpful in an investigation, and they will investigate and liaise with myself to find any information that we can. And the last one is save the chat. And I wrote in advance, because if you don't have it set so you can save the chat, then you cannot save the chat. So the last thing I'm going to do is just show you quickly about how to do the chat saving. So within your settings here, right now I've got this checkbox of prevent participants from saving chat. If I want to turn on an auto saving chat or allow myself to save the chat, I have to turn that off. And then I can do something like this. I can turn on auto saving chat. And what that does is after the meeting's over, I will just have a file pop up, like a Word file of who said what and when. And if I didn't enable this, because I've unchecked this box, there is an option to be able to save the chat available from within the chat window itself. And important to note that these changes only take effect in the next meeting that you have. So for example, I've made these changes now, they're not affecting our current meeting. So you have to, either has to be before you start the meeting or before your next meeting. But there is another way, so I'm going to put that back on. There is another way to save the chat, and it is within recording. So if you happen to be recording to the cloud specifically, you can go to your cloud recording settings here, and you can find this one, save chat messages from the meeting or webinar. And that will do the same thing. It will create a chat file that you can download after the fact. So when you go to your recording files afterwards, you can click on chat file and you can download that. And so that way you can prevent participants from saving the chat within the meeting, but still have the chat saved for yourself, so long as you were recording to the cloud.